Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. But this is our lecture number 5, where we had to cover the second part of the arthrology and the first part of the myology. So it is still locomotor system. The third part has to be finished and the fourth part has to be started here. The third is about the joints and the fourth is about the muscular system. We had started about the arthrology in our previous lecture. You can recall from the previous, and the same goes for today's lecture about the arthrology. And for myology, look at the textbooks from where you have to read the related text only. These are the learning outcomes for the topic of arthrology. The ones I have turned into red color, these are the ones we have already covered. But the first one, it remained the classification of the joints according to the structure or function, number of bones, shape of the articular surface. What are joints and why do we need them? We talked about it, that there are two fundamental functions we can come down to. First, to hold the skeleton together for the stability of the skeleton, and at the same time to give mobility to the skeleton, we need the joints. Different bases of classification of the joints can be, as they are mentioned in the left column. It can be a structural base, where the uniting medium between two or more bones coming together to make a joint, that is the basis of it. Then the functional one is related to how movable the articulation is or the joint is. Then the third base would be the number of the bones contributing in formation of that joint. The fourth would be the shape of the articular surface of the two bones or more bones coming together to make up the joint. Then axis of the movement can be another basis for classification of the joint. Talking about the structural classification, we said that it is based upon the uniting medium between the articular surfaces, or the edges of the bones coming together to make up this joint. There can be one class which is called as fibrous joints. Fibrous joints means the medium that is uniting the two bones together are the connective tissue fibers. In such a joint, there is no joint cavity. There's no space left for the joint cavity, right? The fibers are holding the edges together. Most of the fibrous joints, they are immovable. They will be slightly movable if the length of the fibers will be more. So there can be three types in the fibrous joints: sutures, syndesmoses, or gomphosis. Talking about sutures, these are the joints where the uniting medium is the connective tissue fibers, which are short in length, very short. They do not allow movement. So they are immovable in arthrotic joints, like the joints that are found between the flat bones of the skull. During the Middle Age, this connective tissue, which is the short fibers, they ossify, and skull bones, they fuse into a single unit. That is called as synostosis. Then in the fibrous joints, the second type can be syndesmosis, where the uniting medium is still a connective tissue fiber, but these fibers, they are like ligament, band of fibrous connective tissue, longer connective tissue fibers are there. It is still a fibrous joint, so there's no joint cavity there. Slight to considerable movements are possible, like the dew claw, the first digit, the middle one. This is attached to the metacarpals with the help of such a ligament. This is an example of syndesmosis. Then gum forces. This is the joint, the root of the tooth forms with the socket of the bone there. So it's peg in socket fibrous joint. It is like this is the peg, the socket, and this is the root of the tooth, the blue area. It is inserted into this socket. So this is like a peg is inserted into the socket, and all around this peg has fibers connected. On the one end of the fiber there will be this root of the tooth. On the other end it is attached with the periphery of this socket. So this is the peg and socket kind of attachment, and the connective tissue holding all around is called as periodontal ligament. This is gum forces. So is there any movement there? This is called as immovable joint, but at the same time amphiarthrotic. That means some movement is possible. Of course, some movement is possible depending upon the length of the fibers of the periodontal ligament, and this movement is there for the adjustment of the teeth under the pressure of chewing. It is important to be there, and there is slight movement possible in this joint. Cartilaginous joint. The second class in the structure classification will be where the uniting medium is cartilage. Joint cavity will still be absent. They can further be classified into synchondrosis and symphysis. Synchondrosis, where the uniting medium is hyaline cartilage. The glossy cartilage plate is the one uniting the two edges or ends of the bones. It is an immovable joint. This is present in the metaphyseal region of the bone, where the epiphysis is united with the diaphysis of the long bone with the help of a cartilaginous plate, epiphyseal plate. This hyaline cartilage, as shown in the figure, is the uniting medium. This is called as synchondrosis, one type of the cartilaginous joint. The second type of the cartilaginous joint will be where the uniting cartilage is fibrocartilage. The movements possible there will be limited, amphiarthrotic. As the figure shows, this is one example where the bodies of the consecutive vertebrae, they are articulating with each other through a disc, intervertebral disc. That's a fibrocartilaginous material. On the edges at least, it is all fibrocartilaginous. Sometimes in some books it is referred to as partly symphysial and partly synovial in its structure. Another example would be pelvic symphysis, or there is mandibular symphysis. The third class in the structural kind of joints will be, on the basis of the structure, would be where the uniting medium is not a connective tissue or cartilage. It is a space filled with synovial fluid. So there is a cavity, joint cavity is present, which is fluid filled, and this is a kind of joint where movement is freely possible. That is the freely movable diarthrotic kind of joint. There are some structures always associated with the synovial joint. I mentioned those structures in our previous class, but look at them. You can categorize these structures into periarticular structures and intra-articular structures. Intra-articular will be which are coming in the way of articulation. That will be the synovial fluid. They can be discs or menisci. They can be intra-articular ligaments. intercapsular ligaments if they are present in any joint. In this case, the articular cartilage, which is covering the articular surface of the bone, and the synovial membrane, which is the inner layer of the joint capsule, both become little peripheral. Although these are still facing the joint cavity or the inner structures, they're still not periarticular. And then periarticular would be structures which are outside the joint cavity, which can be the fibrous capsule of the joint capsule, the outer fibrous layer, ligaments passing over the capsule, capsular, extracapsular ligaments, the articular surfaces. When I say articular surfaces, that is the bone right here, which is covered with the articular cartilage. So bone itself, the articular surface itself, becomes periarticular in this categorization. Then the other basis would be classification of joint based upon the number of bones contributing in forming that joint. They can be called as simple joints when only two articular surfaces they are coming together to make up a joint. Example, I would have asked, but shoulder joint is an example. Then composite joints. Actually, compound is a better word if you're saying that more than two articular surfaces they are coming together to make up a joint. Composite comes in when more than one kind of movement is also possible on that joint, depending upon the kind of articular surfaces coming together and the arrangement of the bones. So that kind of a joint where more than two bones are coming together to make up a joint is a compound joint. And if those more than two bones they are arranged in such a way and have such kind of articular surfaces that more than one kind of movement is possible as a whole on that joint, that will be a composite joint. For example, a compound joint will be the the compound joint would be the elbow. Elbow would be a compound joint because radius, ulna, and humerus they are coming together. But this compound joint will be simply compound in case of horse, where the radius and ulna are fused, but bones are three, but the radius and ulna are fused. But in case of dog, where the proximal radio-ulnar articulation is there, rotational movement is also possible. Now the same compound elbow joint is also composite in this situation. Then based upon the shape of the articular surfaces, you can name the joints differently. These are usually the synovial joints. Based upon this shape, you can call them plane joints if the surfaces are almost plane, like the articular surfaces of the carpals when they are articulating with each other, intercarpal joints. Plane kind of movements in anaxial, because there is no axis defined in this gliding movement, or between the articular processes of the vertebrae, not between the bodies, between the articular processes of the vertebrae. This is the location where the plane facets are present, almost plane, so plane joint is formed. The other kind can be where one axis is defined and around that axis the movement is happening. This is called as pivot joint. An example of this can be the atlantoaxial joint between the first cervical vertebra and second cervical vertebra. A peg-like structure on the cranial end of the axis, it actually fits into the atlas, and the atlas, it rotates around it. So, or this can be called as the movement around one axis, uniaxial movement, peg and ring kind of movement. Then in the condylar joint, hinge joint, cochlear joint, if you look at these joints, the first one was the hinge, the second condylar, the third cochlear. These are all about one transverse axis. The axis is this way and the movement is happening about this axis, and this is only flexion and extension, and it is called as one plane movement or pendular movement. Then in the condylar, like it is shown in case of the stifle joint or femorotibial joint, this is again uniaxial rotation, slight rotational movement is possible. Uniaxial movement is there. Transverse axis is passing through the joint this way, and about this axis the movement is happening. So this is uniaxial. Same is the case with the cochlear joint at the hock tibiotalar joint between the talus and the tibia. This is the joint which is again uniaxial. This is how the axis is passing, and about this axis the movement is happening, the flexion and extension. So these are the movements which are uniaxial movements. Hinge joint, condylar joint, look at the surfaces. Why are we calling them hinge, condylar, and cochlear? Then ellipsoidal or saddle. If the articular surfaces coming together, one concave, one convex, they are elliptic in outline, then the movement possible is along two planes. And these are biaxial joints. Around two axes, the movement is happening. For the movement which is happening like adduction and abduction, this is the axis, and for the other movement that is flexion and extension, the axis is passing this way. An example can be the atlanto-occipital joint. Then the saddle-like joints, distal interphalangeal joint, that is biaxial joint again. And look at the movement, two-plane movement, flexion, extension, and abduction, adduction. So it is again around two axes, about two axes. Then spheroidal joints. These are the joints like shoulder or hip joint, ball and socket kind of articular surfaces. Universal kind of movements are possible. Multi-axial movements are possible in all directions. There can be limiting factors, but if you look at the articular surfaces, this is how the movement is allowed on these joints. Tight joints. These are the joints which are amphiarthrotic. Slight movement is possible. And one example very important is sacroiliac joint. That means between the wing of the sacrum and wing of the ilium. This is the wing of the ilium. There is some auricular area here which is partially rough and partially smooth. Similar kind of surface would be present on the wing of sacrum, and these two articular surfaces will be held together with very tight ligaments and slight. The smooth area will be covered with some cartilaginous part, otherwise all will be rough for the attachment of the connective tissue fibers. So it's a mixed kind of joint where some parts are tightly joined, where the articular surfaces are tightly connected, and some parts are where slight movement is possible because some smoothness is there, smooth areas are present there. So these are called as the tight joints. Very short and tight ligaments hold the bones together. So this was a learning outcome to be covered about the arthrology. Then the lecture 6 starts here. That is the part 1 of myology. We have to relate the evolutionary adaptation of the muscle arrangements to species requirement. This is the only learning outcome. So when we look at the muscles from this perspective of evolution or evolutionary adaptation, this is how we can describe the adaptations in these 5 points. First would be the portion of a muscle or the muscle itself may be absent. When we look at different species, dog, ox, horse, and we pay attention to the evolutionary adaptation of muscles, we see that forearm rotators are lost in the ungulates, in the hoofed animals. Then we see that subclavius muscle, which is one of the pectoral muscle, this is not present in dog. It is present in goat and it is present in horse as a functional structure, but absent in dog. Then peroneus or fibularis longus, this has been lost in horse. And fibularis tertius is not visible in dog. It's not present there. So these are where the muscle is entirely absent, or it might be present in the form of a portion. The supinators, the pronators, they are not functional, where the rotational movement is not possible between the radius and ulna. Brachioradial muscle, the supinator muscle. The brachioradial is only present in dogs. The supinator is present and functional in dog. In the other species, it will not be required and it will not be functional. It will not be present. Pronator quadratus is only present in dog because it is in the length of the radius and ulna where the articulation is happening and the two bones are held together and they move, but to give pronation. But the round pronator, which is pronator teres, this muscle is functionally present in structurally and functionally both present in dog, but in case of the other two animals, the pronator, if it is present, which is many times visible there, these fibers are not working as pronator. So they can simply do flexion when they try to generate force, cannot pronate because the bones do not allow it. So they're almost vestigious there. So we know that the animal which is going to use the limbs in a way where the pronation and supination is required, the supinator, pronator, teres, pronator, quadratus all will be present and will be functional, but for the other animals, usually those muscles will not be present, and if they are present, they will not be doing that pronation and supination there. Then subclavius is one muscle, which is, as shown in the figure, the location on the cranial border of the scapula is visible, but it is actually attached with the sternum and the first few cartilages of the ribs. This is where it is attached on one end. The other end is reaching on the cranial aspect of the scapula. This is called as cranial pectoral muscle. Will be functional in the horse and is also functional in the goat, and they are well developed there, but in the other species it is not there. In case of the cow, the fibers would be found, but they are not functional. Now this is the muscle. If you look at this video, this muscle actually, when the limb is not bearing weight, it is free, then the limb will be drawn backward. This muscle will help to bring the limb backward. But if the limb is weight bearing, then the body will be thrust forward. So this is the function of this muscle, subclavius. Then a portion of the muscle may be absent, or the entire muscle may be absent in a species. So this is again, this is kind of a repetition. Peroneus tertius is only peroneal muscle. It's the only peroneal muscle in horse. It is absent in dog. but peroneus longus is absent in horse, and peroneus brevis is only found in carnivores and humans. Brevis means short. Then the second thing that we can pay attention to when we are looking at the evolutionary adaptation is that a portion of the muscle may be represented in a different form, or it may shift to another muscle group. That is like rearrangement of the clavicular muscles in quadrupeds. In these figures, you can see these are the muscles. One of the muscle here, which is beginning or attaching with the clavicle, is reaching the humerus. So this is kind of an intrinsic muscle, cleidobrachialis, it should be. And this is the intrinsic muscle in this being. But the other part that might be called as the cleidocephalic part or cleidomastoid part. The mastoid process is also present on the skull, so that part shown with the dark color, this is attached on one end with the clavicle, on the other end with the skull, but now this can be considered as an extrinsic muscle of the forelimb. While in case of the animals, if you see, because clavicle has been reduced to just clavicular intersection in this location, so the entire muscle is now called as brachiocephalic muscle, or if we look at the direction of the fibers from the clavicular intersection, the cleidobrachialis part and then cleidocephalic part, which is again, depending upon the animal, the cleidomastoid and cleido-occipitalis in ox, and cleidomastoid and cleidocervicalis in case of dog. So the entire muscle becomes the extrinsic muscle of the forelimb. Then thinking on the same line, we see that the superficial gluteal muscle and biceps femoris muscle, they are separate muscles in the horse and cater to its requirement, while the same gluteal muscle has been fused with the biceps femoris to form one single muscle, which is called as gluteobiceps in case of ox. And because these two animals might use these muscles very differently, so this kind of merger of two muscles to give strength to one animal on the side and to the other animal on the back. Although the horses can also kick laterally, but usually they would kick rearly. The rear kick will be a way to defend themselves, but they can also cow kick. Cows usually can't kick laterally. Then the third way of looking at them would be that as the number of the digits they change from one species to the other, some muscles might be represented as ligaments, or they will of course have less number of tendons. For example, the common digital extensor, the long digital extensor, are similar kind of muscles which are reaching the digits. Depending upon the number of digits, their tendons of insertions will change according to the number of digits. But look at this muscle shown here. This is the interosseous muscle. This is at the location of the metacarpals. Between the adjacent metacarpals on the flexor surface, this muscle belly is present as interossei. Very visible in case of the dog. In case of the cow, you see some fibers there. Yes, they are there. And then in case of the horse, it is totally ligamentous structures, no more fibers there. And look at the point of insertion there towards the proximal phalanx, a pair of palmar proximal sesamoids. They are there in their tendons of insertions. This is the case, and what happens is that in case of the horse, this muscle has now become a ligamentous structure, which is called the suspensory ligament, part of the suspensory apparatus, which is very important to prevent the fetlock joint from hyperdorsiflexion, or can be called as the hyperextension of the develop joint under the weight of the animal or under the thirst. So, and the other thing would be when the weight is lifted off from this joint, it should get back to its original state. So that is the function of the suspensory apparatus, and this muscle is now acting as suspensory ligament in horse. This was what I mentioned earlier also in the previous slide, but this is what I meant by change in the number of tendons of insertion depending upon the animal's digits. If there is only one digit, so one tendon of insertion would be there for such a muscle. If there are two digits there, two splits of that tendon will be present there, and if there are four digits or five digits, then 4 or 5 slips of that tendon will be there in that animal. Then if you look at the muscles of mastication, which are required for chewing, they might be composed or arranged differently in different animals, because we know that the 3 species we are talking about, they have different kind of dentition, because they procure their food differently. So for the canines where the tearing and biting is required, the temporalis muscle, which attaches with the mandible, or this has to be stronger there. While for the other animal as shown here, you see the chewing action, and the masseter muscle that is actually filling up the space of the mandible, and then this muscle which is coming from the sternum, the sternocephalic muscle reaching the skull, it also has an extra slip going to the mandible, sternomandibularis, to help this animal chew and move the lower jaw side to side. So this is one adaptation that we see in the muscles which are helping in mastication or tearing and biting in these animals. Then the same muscle can have different divisions in different animals, like deltoides has an acromial part and spinous part in all the domestic animals, but in horse, because the acromion process is not present there on the scapula, so acromial part will be missing. Then the triceps brachii muscle has long head, lateral head, medial head, and accessory head in all the domestic species, but in horse there's no accessory head there. Then sartorius is a muscle of the hind limb, which is undivided in all these species. In case of horse and ox, it's just a medial division of the sartorius, which is called as the sartorius muscle. But in case of dog, there is one cranial slip and one medial slip there, and so the dog can, using this muscle, it can flex the hip joint and it can flex the stifle joint with the same muscle, the sartorius. But in the other two large species where only the medial belly of the sartorius is present, those animals can use this muscle to flex the hip joint. The dog can flex and extend the stifle joint using this muscle, but look at the position of the dog where both the hip joint and the stifle, they are flexed at the same time, so sartorius is playing its role there. Of course, it has its function while the dog is moving also, but this is one difference you can memorize with respect to the sartorius. So this was all about relating the evolutionary adaptation of the muscle arrangement to the species requirement. But if you notice, there was a question on slide number 7. You have to submit its answer to Mr. Shafiq by 23rd October till 4 p.m. And for the next class, topic would be myology, inshallah, the remaining part of myology. And do make sure that you're done with your assignments or recommended reading by then, have gone through the previous lecture, and have gone through the outline of the topic for that day's lecture when I give you. Thank you very much.